Okay, great. It looks like we are at exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, so we will get started. Your sound is good on my end, Edo, so we're good there. So today we're listening to the defense of Edward or Edo Forsythe's dissertation entitled A Qualitative Case Study of Japanese University Students and Personal Smartphone Use in English as a Foreign Language Classes. So if you're ready, Edo, you can get started.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I begin, I'd like to say thank you to Michelle and Peggy for their guidance along the way. They made the journey a lot easier, and I learned a lot through the process, and I hope what I share today helps some of the attendees. So I have been teaching at a Japanese university now for about 7 years, and one thing that I noticed upon moving here was that smartphones or cell phones were everywhere, but computers were not really as prolific as I had experienced in American universities. And of course, as cell phones developed into smartphones, I saw more and more teachers using them in the classroom. There's a lot of research available that discusses the various ways in how smartphones are used in the language classroom, and I became curious as to how students felt about this. Stockwell and Liu and White and Mills, some of my colleagues here in Japan, have done investigations into how the students feel about being required to use their cell phones, particularly smartphones. And but the research was done at prestigious private universities, and I was curious as to how regular Japanese university students felt about that. So that was what began my my focus and my drive towards this dissertation. In looking into a qualitative case study of Japanese university students and personal smartphone use in English as a foreign language classes, or EFL is how I will refer to it through the rest of the defense. I looked at a wide variety of existing literature because I wanted to make sure that my research was firmly grounded in existing theory and existing literature and complemented the recommendations by others. So specifically, I looked at a historical overview of mobile assisted language learning, or MAL, in Japanese EFL situations, and particularly into how they're used for extensive reading, speaking practice, intercultural communications, vocabulary study, the various skills and the various ways they're used in the language classroom. Mobile devices in Japanese EFL classes are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and a lot more people are using them, and I explored exactly how they're being used and what research has explained the student perspectives on them and the social media perspectives of them as well. One thing I did realize in doing the literature review was that there's very little research on general student perceptions of being required to use their personal smartphone in the EFL class. So that is where I chose to focus my dissertation research. Now, the problem that guided my research was that EFL teachers in Japanese universities require students to use their smartphones to perform language learning activities, and little is known about how those students feel about being required to use their personal smartphones. So the purpose of my study was to determine how students feel about being required to use their personal smartphones for EFL classroom activities. If this study were not conducted, if we really didn't understand how students felt about being required to use their smartphones, the current trends that we see in the field may unknowingly have an adverse effect on students' motivation, on their participation in the classes. So I think I found it was important to find out exactly how the students felt about this. So that was the purpose of my dissertation. I have one research question that guided my study. That was, how do Japanese university students perceive the requirement to use their personal smartphones to complete EFL classroom activities, tasks, and assignments? The picture you see here is taken from one of my classes at the research university. I got the students' permission to use this picture to demonstrate them using their cell phones in the classroom. It's a common sight in my classroom. So that's kind of what you'll see when you walk in. The methodology behind my research began as a qualitative single case study. I had 9 participants who were all freshmen at public Japanese university in northern Japan. All of the students completed a blended EFL course with me last fall semester. However, they had completed the course whenever the research began. There were 6 female and 3 male participants, which was roughly equivalent to the class ratio of male to female. So I believe that the participants, the sample was quite representative of the population that the sample framed. Data in the study was collected using semi-structured interviews in Japanese. There were 9 questions taken from similar research. I mentioned Stockwell and Liu and White and Mills, and those questions were adapted to fit my context. I used an interview protocol as I did the interviews and allowed the students to respond freely. In addition to the verbal answers to the questions, I observed the nonverbal communications to make sure that the students' answers were correct, not correct, but matched their feelings. I was concerned that they may want to tell me what they think I wanted to hear, so I observed nonverbal communications and triangulated the data to make sure that I was getting an accurate representation of their perceptions. Of course, informed consent was obtained before conducting this research, and I also received consent to record all of the interviews. The interview that I used, the interview protocol that I used had 9 questions adapted from the studies listed on the slide. And the data, once I completed data collection, the interviews were transcribed from Japanese into English and then translated by myself and research assistants. Once the data was translated into English, it was analyzed using the online Deduce qualitative research analysis tool. Following stakes, categorical aggregation, and pattern discovery methods, looking for general themes that developed in the data as I reviewed it. The validity of the data was triangulated using the nonverbal communications, as I mentioned before. So how was the data analyzed in detail? So I transcribed it using myself and researchers who were native speakers transcribed directly from the audio into Japanese transcripts. And once I had the Japanese transcripts that were verified as well by native speakers, myself and research assistants translated them into English and then put the data of each question into separate files within the Deduce online data analysis tool, and each question's answers were coded twice to make sure that I was able to pull out the themes and observe the appropriate, was able to identify the themes that were emerging as they came out. Before I go into explaining the findings of the research, I'd like to discuss the participant demographics a little bit. As I said earlier, there were 9 participants, 6 of whom were female and 3 were male. They were all freshmen from various departments within the university. However, I did not collect data regarding each participant's major. I tried to keep the personal information of the participants as anonymous as possible, so I only used numbers when referring to them within the data itself. Another aspect that I did not collect was the students' ages. However, they were all freshmen, so going by the average age of freshmen at Japanese universities, you could feasibly assume that the ages were between 17 and 19 years of age. Further, I did not collect any information on the students' hometown, the participants' hometown or secondary school background. But given the demographics of the university that I conducted the research at, you could say their hometowns, or they were from across northern Japan, which would be generally an area north of Tokyo. So if you're familiar with Japan, most of the students at the research site come from towns and cities around Tokyo or north. In order to obtain the 9 participants, I did use a purposeful sampling. So I recruited volunteers. All of the participants were volunteers. And I recruited them using email messages and SMS messages directly to their cell phones to the students who indicated they would be interested in participating. Now to get into the results. So before, the first thing I wanted to establish was what experience were the students bringing with them when they came to my classroom regarding using cell phones or smartphones in their English language classrooms. So the first question was asking what experience they had, and most of them had no previous experience. Two-thirds of the 9, so 6 of them had no experience. The 3 that did had very minimal. And this confirms findings found by Lockley that say students, university students in Japan are coming to us with a fairly low amount of technology experience or even technical ability. The 3 that did use their smartphones prior had used them in high school English classes, either at the behest of or not really behest, at the suggestion of their teacher, because high schools don't allow students to use their smartphones in most cases in Japan. So the students did not have a lot of background in using their smartphones for EFL studies. So question 2 in the interview asked about the feelings regarding using their smartphone in my class, the English speaking course, which they attended. All of the participants in the study said that it was a good experience. Because it was new for the majority of them, they said it was surprising at first, but they got used to it, and in the end, most thought it was very helpful. The third question looked at how they felt about being required to use their own smartphone as opposed to a device given to them by the university. And that was specifically how I framed it, as opposed to using a device that was given to them by the university. All of the participants preferred their own because they were used to it. It was a device they used every hour of every day, and they are very familiar with its functionality and capabilities. None of the participants indicated a reluctance or that they felt like they were being forced to use their own device. So that's good. I was very happy to see that. I hadn't made any of them uncomfortable by requiring them to use their personal phones or smartphones. Some of the reasons why they said they preferred it using their own device was because it gave them a sense of control over their learning. And also, because it was their device, they could continue the classroom activities outside of class much more easily. We had a class website where there were some of the information was included for them for each class, and even if they missed a class, they had access to it. It was all on their phone right there. They didn't have to go looking for it. So the convenience of having it on their own device was one of the biggest selling points. Question 4 then asked about their general feelings of being, of whether they felt that using smartphones in the language classroom was beneficial. All of the participants considered the smartphones to be very helpful and beneficial in the EFL classroom, particularly for watching and listening to audiovisual materials. Specifically, being able to control the playback of the AV materials was a key item of importance for them, because if they missed something, they could very easily go back and listen to it again. There was a definite reluctance to ask if we were listening to audio on the classroom audio system. The students indicated that they felt reluctant to ask to repeat a section for themselves, not wanting to impinge on the other students. So if they have personal control, then they're able to play the difficult parts whenever they need to, as many times as they needed to. Additionally, having their cell phones right at their hand allowed them to access the internet for information that was relevant to the topic that they were studying in the classroom. So if they came across a concept or a word they didn't know, they could look it up immediately and then go right back into the classroom activities. So there was no transition. It was very good for situational learning, which was one of the theories that really supports the use of mobile assisted language learning. Now, of course, using the smartphones in the language classroom, there are many, but there's potential for a variety of problems. So I asked in question 5 if they had experienced any trouble using their smartphones in their EFL classroom. And none of them, thankfully, felt that they had any problems with the smartphones for conducting the activities. Of course, there were some connectivity issues. One of the common comments that were given was that the Wi-Fi in the classroom, and the university provides campus-wide Wi-Fi, and most of the students used that when they were streaming video for the class. They noticed that the Wi-Fi connection did get slow when everybody in the class was streaming the video. But as far as technical problems with using the smartphones, there were none issued. Occasionally a student would forget their smartphone or forget their headphones, and I found that they were fairly adaptable when it came to those situations. So, in addition to using the smartphones in their EFL classes, next I wanted to look at how they felt about being required to use their smartphones in other teachers' EFL classes, or if this was something particular to my class that they preferred. So question number 6 asked the opinion, the participants' opinion of other teachers requiring them to use their smartphones in EFL classes. Overall, the participants said yes. Other professors should be having students use their smartphones whenever appropriate, especially for listening and speaking classes. There were a few participants that indicated some reluctance to using it for reading and writing classes, but when I asked for further information about that, most of them said that it would be appropriate, they just hadn't experienced it and weren't sure about how they would feel reading on small screens or things like that, or writing on a smartphone. So the good thing is the students were comfortable enough with using their smartphones that they want other teachers to continue this practice. And the final 3 questions that I explored were whether the students themselves would continue to use their smartphones for their own EFL studies after leaving my classroom or my course. And most of them indicated a strong probability of continued use, particularly vocabulary study applications. At the end of the course, I shared a variety of websites and applications that would enable them to continue their studies on the go whenever possible. So all but one of the participants was open to it, and the other one, the one participant who was not open to it, preferred textbook and paper for studying. They found it more beneficial and more productive whenever they used the textbook and paper. So that goes to show that not everybody is completely ready to use smartphones exclusively. So, in looking at the perceptions, how did the students feel about using their smartphones in EFL classes? Question 8 asked whether they thought the classes were more enjoyable than classes without smartphones, and every participant found that the classes with smartphones were interesting, exciting, and fun. There was a novelty aspect. Some of them mentioned that never having done it before, it was nice to try something new. They did like having control of the audio-visual materials, so that gave them a sense that they were in control of their learning. So they really appreciated that. And not just enjoyable, but question 9 looked at whether the participants thought the classes were more productive if they had smartphones in them. And unanimously, every participant considered the classes with smartphones were more productive. And the reasons that they stated included self-control of AV materials, specifically being better than the AV system in the classroom because it personalizes the learning. Situational learning, allowing them to look up information when they need it. Conducting activities such as watching and listening, creating their own AV materials. A lot of the students were required to. The students were required to create audio recordings and videos as part of the classroom, and doing that with their own smartphone was really convenient and exciting for them. So that kind of practice and use of the smartphone led them to feel that the classes with smartphones were more productive than those without. So the findings that I've identified through these 9 questions were in line with previous research in the field. The research conducted by Stockwell and New and White and Mills indicated that students preferred to use their smartphones in their EFL classes, and that is the indications that I took away from the data analysis of this study. So what implications does that have for EFL teaching in Japan or Japanese universities? Well, first, this study addressed the gap in research that was identified by Hall and Illich and Stockwell, saying that we need to understand how students feel about using their smartphones, and the study showed that they have a desire for more EFL professors to have them or allow them to use their smartphones and to incorporate mobile assisted language learning teaching methods in the English classes. That aligns with research found by Lockley and Promitz Hayashi, that students want more smartphone use in their language classes. They see the benefit, they're comfortable with it. And next, students believe that MAL is appropriate, and they kind of expect us to allow them to use it. It's a tool they use in their daily lives. It's a very powerful tool, and the students or the participants in this study and the others have demonstrated that they want us to continue, us being university professors in Japanese universities. So the trend of student smartphone use should continue in Japanese universities. But we do need to remember that some some of the students still prefer textbooks and paper-based materials, so we can't completely switch to mobile-assisted language learning, but a blended approach is probably preferable. So how do these implications apply to practice? The recommendations that this study would indicate for the practice of teaching EFL in Japanese universities is that first and foremost, Japanese university professors should continue to incorporate MAL methodology using the students' smartphones, taking advantage of those tools that are in their pockets or in their bags is the future of EFL in Japanese universities. Because of the ability that the students had to research information and to look up content online whenever necessary or whenever the situation dictated, meant that the classes are more productive and more beneficial for the students. And they enjoy it. They really prefer using their own smartphones for interacting with and creating audiovisual materials. So that's the kind of active learning and self-controlled learning that we can allow the students to use and to take advantage of by allowing them to use their smartphones in the classroom. So bottom line, we have to take advantage of the students' smartphones by using MAL teaching methods in the Japanese EFL classes. But this study is not the end-all be-all, as much as I would like it to be. There's a lot of research to be conducted in the future. So recommendations first would be the logical step are replication studies at both public and private universities across Japan. My sample size was really small, and it was a single case study. So I think I provide a very good insight into the into the world of EFL in EFL education in Japan. However, it's a small picture, and we need many more replication studies to see what the students really feel across the population. In addition, the literature review indicated that there were no published studies that I could find regarding the teachers' perceptions of using the students' smartphones in Japanese university EFL classrooms. So this is an area that needs to be explored as well. How do the teachers feel about letting their students use smartphones? What benefits do they see? What challenges do they experience? Those kind of things, I believe, need to be explored in detail in the future. So more research is definitely needed to truly reveal the student and teacher perceptions of mobile-assisted language learning in Japanese EFL classes. I personally will continue to explore this, and I'm already looking at my next research study. So I will continue this, and I do hope that others pick up the torch and carry it alongside me. So that brings me to the end of my defense. This information will be presented at a conference in Vietnam the end of November at the Asia Call Conference. So I'm looking forward to sharing my findings not only with my colleagues here in Japan, some of which have joined me today, and I appreciate them coming, but also at conferences within Japan and within Asia as an area. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box in the GoToMeeting window.
Thank you so much, Edo. So as Edo indicated, we will pause now for any questions.
Can I speak my question?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say, Edo, thank you very much for all your hard work and a great presentation. As some of you may know, I'm actually in a different part of Japan. I'm more in Tokyo, actually West Tokyo. And what I really liked about my biggest takeaway from this research is it's nice to know that from student voices that what's already being said in the Tokyo area as well, that it aligns with what students already feel here as well, that smartphones are great tools and they like using them, and it's good to know that even in North Japan that the sentiment is the same. So I think your contribution, Edo, is really significant, because it's echoing across the nation that it's time to pick it up, and this is good for teachers to listen to as well. So even though you have a small sample size, I like the quality of the work and some of the findings coming out of there. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much, and I will definitely be sharing these findings and this information widely and loudly here in Japan, because I agree, it's a resource that we could be taking much better advantage of and helping our students to learn more effectively in their EFL studies. So I see a question from Andrew, who happens to be my brother, actually. He asks whether I feel the home life or high school experience would influence the students' perceptions of the use of smartphones in the course studies. I don't feel that, I was interested to see if they had any experience in using their smartphones. I don't know to what degree their hometown or their regional background would have an impact on that. Even up here where we are, I mean, Japan in general seems to consider our area as a more rural area. It is definitely a more rural area, and even our students here are obviously interested in and desire the use of smartphones. So even in the urban areas, I don't think there'd be any difference. So that's a good question. That looking into the regional differences in perceptions might be an area of future research. Thank you for the question.
This is Peggy Kramer. I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you say that they did not have very good IT services and not many computers?
They have good IT services. However, when I first moved here 7 years ago, the number of students who came to university with computer was, I would say, about 25%. A lot more universities are requiring them. The site that I did this research at does require their freshmen to bring a computer, to have a computer when they come. However, there's not really a lot of programs to get the teachers involved in using, taking advantage of those student resources. So the research has shown that students are actually much more functional in their smartphones than they are in regular PCs, which is kind of shocking.
That is interesting. I would not have expected that, but maybe that's the wave of the future, right?
Yeah, quite possibly the wave of the future. As smartphones develop and are increasing, their capabilities are increasing every time a new iteration comes out. But yeah, there are some holdbacks. Reading and writing on smartphones does take some practice, and especially the writing aspect of it. But as far as Japanese student population goes, they're much more heavily reliant on using their smartphones for everything from communicating with themselves or like amongst themselves to teachers and things like that. So much more so than PCs. And thank you for your comment, Vanessa. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining me this evening.
So I did have a question. It was mostly related to why cell phones over other types of devices, but I actually believe you really answered it for me.
Okay.
It is true, even here in the U.S., that kids are more adept at using cell phone technology than computers. And that definitely links back to the fact that that's more of their preferred communication. So it does not surprise me that similar findings might be applied to those in Japan.
Yes.
But it does make sense
Yeah,
a lot about why it's more portable. I mean, there's a variety of reasons why kids prefer, and when we say kids, I mean young adults as well, but it's also true of teenagers as well. It's a big shift to the preference over that, which is, it's always interesting when I interview kids and their tech skills for the computer are very low, but their cell phone skills are pretty good. So it's pretty interesting. I expect that to continue here in the future.
Yeah, I think so too. One of the things that kind of surprised me when I first came is the computer ownership, the household computer ownership was really low compared to my experiences in America when I first moved here 7 years ago, and even now, it's not as prolific as you would expect a first world nation like Japan, who is I mean, it is kind of stereotypical, but it's seen as being much more technologically advanced. Yet the culture has developed a more personal use of smartphones and even like feature phones prior to smartphones. They were much more advanced in their cell phone technology than what we were getting back in America. So yeah, the trend has always been for mobile devices over PCs. And I did see a question in the chat box from Andrew about particular apps. There was no specific app that they mentioned using, and I didn't require a specific language app in my classroom. The ones who did have experience in using it, they used some vocabulary study apps. Some that were recommended either by a previous teacher or that they had found on their own. But in the classroom, just using the technology, the novelty of it, I think, was an important aspect. So it didn't really matter what app they were using, just having the ability to control their learning, I think, was the biggest selling point for them.
This is Peggy Kramer again. Because I work with English as a second language and special ed, I tried to think how to relate it to special needs. And one thing you said that's so important, which even special educators sometimes miss, is that you have to keep options. You mentioned that, and that's excellent. But I'm trying to think how you might use it with students with special needs. Any ideas?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that the aspect of special needs students is that they're all individuals. Each one has specific strengths and weaknesses or challenges, and I think technology does give us more tools in our tool bag to help reach each student. And if they're more visual learners, then you can use cell phones or even tablet technology to address visual learning as opposed to tactile learners who may want to use a different kind of app to drag information around a screen or to compile things using technology that way.
To answer your question, Peggy, this is Michelle. I can see it having so a lot of times there's like speak assistant technology that these kids bring with them to class that not every like paraprofessional or teacher has familiarity with, but maybe like in the future there could be apps that on a cell phone that could perform that particular function, so expensive equipment won't be needed, but it'd also be a little bit more familiar to the paraprofessionals and the teachers in the classrooms. At least that's some thoughts that I have about that.
That's a good point.
Edo, if I may interject at this point, I found that one point that you raised here, I noticed that you're doing this at higher education. And you also made the point that in high schools it's pretty much verboten to use smartphones in a classroom, and it's pretty much a no-no. And then someone mentioned earlier that we are working, when you're working with first-year university students, you're entering into the threshold of more young adults and less dealing with children. And for the most part, Japanese youths in high school are treated like children, and I found that if you treat them like children, they'll behave like children. And one thing I like about using smartphones is entrusting the learners with a measure of trust, and just sort of saying, look, now you can use this for whatever features are on there, like a dictionary or this and that. And from my experience, there's that shock that you mentioned earlier before, but there's also that the students like that. They like being entrusted with a sense of responsibility, and now they said, wow, now I could actually use this thing for learning as well. So I just wanted to mention that point.
Yes, thank you. And that was one thing my students really wished other teachers would take advantage of the tool they have in their hand and allow them to use it. And I have daughters in high school, a daughter in high school, and one who's a freshman in college, and they weren't allowed to use their cell phones at all during the day. And that was a frustration for them because they had at least experienced American elementary school, and even there they were using technology regularly. So it was a big change for them.
Are there any other questions for Edo before we break?
Hi, I'm Alvar. I'm working together with Edo at Gakuin in Hirosaki, and I've been working at Hirosaki University with him. And for me, this presentation has been really revealing because I'm also teaching English, and the way you present the usage of smartphones as a positive tool for the students to interact with the class has been really revealing for me as a teacher. And you mentioned it that we need to do more research on how the teachers deal with these kind of new tools. Mm-hmm. And for me, being in the 50s, these smartphones and gadgets that kids love is not really that convenient for me or for a teacher in my age. So how can we help teachers implement or use these tools more in their teaching?
That's a really good question, and it's a question that we've struggled with in the field of CAL, or computer-assisted language learning, for decades now. There's always been teachers who themselves were unfamiliar with the technology, so they weren't able to really conceptualize how it can benefit the classroom and the students. I think the biggest challenge for following my recommendations and including more smartphone use in the Japanese EFL classroom is teaching and demonstrating to all the teachers out there exactly how effective it can be, and showing that the students want it. And if you approach it from that perspective, is something the students want, and it's not just all fun and games, it's an effective learning tool, and helps them visualize how it can be effective and in what ways, the selling them one that will be much easier. But it's an uphill battle, like you said.
And I think that probably in Japan this battle is much more difficult than going to Europe or to America, I guess.
Oh, yeah, quite possibly, yes. And thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate you staying up late with me.
No worries.
All right, doesn't appear to be any questions, so we'll take our break now. And Peggy and I will stay on the line, but I'll